Good afternoon and welcome to today's AEI webinar from Reform to Results, Making Education a True Profession. I'm Robert Pondicio, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted you could join us today. For more than a generation, education reform has been driven by well-intended efforts, new standards, new accountability systems, new programs, new initiatives. But despite all of that activity, too little of what we know about effective teaching and learning reliably finds its way into classrooms. We seem condemned to rediscover what works, forget it, then rediscover it again a decade or so later. Doug Carnine has spent much of his career asking why this keeps happening. His answer is both simple and profound. Education has never truly operated as a profession, one with shared standards of practice, a coherent knowledge base, and mechanisms for ensuring that expertise is developed, sustained, and passed on. Until that changes, Doug argues, we will continue to experience reform as a pendulum, not progress. Doug previewed this argument recently on my Substack, The Next 30 Years, and I'm thrilled that he's joined today by two people who bring essential perspectives to our conversation. Let me introduce them. Mike Schmoker is the author of Results Now and Focus, two of the most influential books on school improvement in the last 20 years. And Dr. Sarah Oberle is a practicing classroom teacher and instructional coach who brings the indispensable voice of the profession in the making, what these ideas actually look and feel like to the teachers we too often talk about but not talk to. So here's how we'll spend the next 75 minutes. We'll begin with a presentation from Doug, laying out his case for making education a true profession. After that, I'll moderate a discussion with Doug, Mike, and Sarah. And we'll leave time at the end for your questions, which you can submit at any point through the Q&A function or by emailing my colleague Annika Hernandez at aei.org. Her email address is in the event flyer. With that, thank you again for being with us, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to Doug Carnine to get us started. Go ahead, Doug.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually very honored to be able to make this presentation. As Robert said, it's been a focus of my career, and I'm hoping that this presentation will lead to a better understanding of why we really need to make education a research-based profession. So, in education, the use of research is optional. However, the associated costs remain unacceptably high. At a 2025 congressional hearing, Chair Kevin Keeley noted that national reading and math scores have essentially flatlined since '71. Today, only 31% of fourth graders and 30% of eighth graders read at a proficient level. Said differently, nearly 7 in 10 are not proficient. These numbers are not mere statistics. They represent millions of children starting life with an academic handicap that often compounds into a lifetime of diminished opportunity. Mackie Raymond of Stanford Center for Research on Education Outcomes captured the futility of 4 decades of reform when she titled a recent retrospective essay, quote, "Times have changed, the school system, not so much." Most succinct is a comment by AEI's Frederick Hess, quote, "Musings about the tired tropes that so often dominate our education debates." These frank assessments should force us to ask, why have wave after wave of reform produced so little change? The answer lies in the fact that education lacks the institutional safeguards other professions take for granted. Discredited ideas keep returning to education, but this does not happen in research-based professions. In the distant past, surgeons did not wash their hands before performing surgery. Once sterile technique was settled as science, it was incorporated into practice with no turning back. Surgeons have continued washing their hands ever since. Similarly, at one time, doctors treated ulcers by advising patients to reduce their stress. Once it was discovered that antibiotics cured ulcers, doctors never went back to suggesting stress was the cause. Professions grounded in evidence don't revert to disproven practices, but instead, They build on that evidence to further benefit their clients, as shown in medicine, public health, aviation, accounting, engineering, and agriculture. So, for example, my brother-in-law is a farmer who, in 2012, had to plow under his seed corn due to the drought. A drought of equal magnitude occurred in 2025, but the yield was robust due to the use of genetically engineered seed corn. Improvements in the engineering of agricultural equipment are equally impressive. Intelligent precision spraying is an advanced weed detection sensor technology that significantly reduces herbicide use by applying chemicals only to the weeds, achieving savings of up to 90%. The system automatically adjusts the nozzle output based on satellite-derived speed and location data, even as farmers move through their fields at up to speeds of 15 miles an hour. Farmers buy fewer chemicals, and the earth is burdened with fewer chemicals. So, the contrast between education and continually improving benefits provided by research professions such as agriculture it's striking, but it's actually disturbing. Rather than building on research findings, education lurks on a pendulum, swinging back and forth between approaches that have already been tested and found wanting. Nowhere is this clearer than in reading instruction. Phonics has been adopted, abandoned, rediscovered, and abandoned again. In the 1980s, whole language shoved it aside. In the 90s, phonics made a comeback only to be marginalized again until Sold a Story and the Mississippi Miracle brought it back to center stage. As Emily Hanford, the journalist, said, quote, "I don't like the analogy of the pendulum. It swings back and forth with no sense of progress. If the pendulum is phonics, I hope that never happens again. We'll see." This endless cycling is not progress. It is the symptom of a deeper, disquieting flaw. Education has never become a research-based profession. There are 5 pillars of a research-based profession. Professions that truly put evidence at their core, medicine, accounting, aviation, engineering, seamanship, and agriculture, are built on these 5 pillars. Education also needs all 5. These pillars, which would empower educators to improve student outcomes, are similar to what has been accomplished in the Southern Surge states that have realized such positive results. The first pillar is a shared knowledge base. Effective practices and policies exist in early reading, but unlike medicine's consensus on germ theory, education does not consistently adopt or adhere to them. This leaves classrooms open to fad and opinion. Second, research-aligned educator preparation. Aspiring doctors learn evidence-based medicine during their residencies. By contrast, a recent review found only 28% of teacher preparation programs fully equip teachers with the essentials of reading. Even worse, 91% earned a grade of C or lower in clinical practice. If the majority of medical residencies were so poor, we would call it malpractice. Third, education licensure rooted in competence. Half the states allow teachers to enter classrooms without passing a research-based exam in reading instruction. Imagine licensing a surgeon who had never demonstrated knowledge of sterile practice. Fourth, accreditation of teacher preparation programs with T. 97% of teacher preparation programs that fail to prepare candidates effectively are still accredited. No other serious profession tolerates such laxity. Finally, accountability for quality of educational practice. States, districts, schools, and educator preparations programs should be accountable for adhering to the knowledge base. Accountability at the teacher level requires administrator support in terms of teachers receiving the knowledge, skills, and resources necessary to teach effectively. Until these 5 pillars are in place, education will continue to swing with the pendulum. Professions, if you look at the history, they almost never reform themselves voluntarily. They change after a crisis of trust forces the issue. The Titanic sinking spurred international standards for maritime safety. The Great Depression led to the establishment of the Securities Exchange Commission. Medicine itself only embraced evidence systemically after public frustration with poor and inconsistent outcomes, as illustrated by the thalidomide tragedy. We are in the midst of an education crisis of trust. The flatline scores, the persistent inequalities, the exasperation of parents, all signal a system that no longer commands confidence. The question is whether we will respond with seriousness equal to the challenge. Let me repeat that. Will we respond with seriousness equal to the challenge? That's why I'm here today, to ask that question. So, other professions confronted their crisis of trust by installing guardrails, basically the 5 pillars. These 5 pillars both limited professional discretion and empowered practitioners who wanted to do the right thing by their clients. After the Titanic, sea captains lost some freedom of movement, but gained a coherent system of safety standards that saved lives. Education needs to make the shift to become a research-based profession, the same shift that all genuine professions have had to go through. The Evidence Advocacy Center, which was launched by myself, Linda Diamond, Kelly Butler, who was the CEO of the Barksdale Institute, a key person in the Mississippi Miracle, and researcher Reed Lyon. The Evidence Advocacy Center has developed a plan to facilitate this shift, this transformation. It has curated a repository of research-based resources, model policies, and implementation guides that make this knowledge base readily available to state departments, districts, parent and family advocates, and educator preparation programs. Inside the profession, an alliance of evidence-aligned organizations must codify, monitor, and advocate for the adoption and implementation of the 5 pillars. The alliance will work with research-aligned teacher preparation programs, high-achieving states and districts, subject matter associations, and professional organizations. The Evidence Advocacy Center will support a consortium of states and districts in adopting, implementing, and institutionalizing improved educator preparation, as well as improved continuing education and professional learning for the current workforce. We'll go back here. But history shows insiders alone are not enough. External pressure has always been crucial in transforming an occupation into a research-based profession. Transforming education requires a collaboration of parent and family groups, business leaders, social justice advocates, elected officials, and community colleges. They provide the urgency, the public voice, and the political leverage to demand lasting change. However, the plan to institutionalize the 5 pillars will succeed only through the combined pressure and support of an alliance of insiders and a collaboration of outsiders. Professional change will come only with the pressure and support from insiders and outsiders. I'll elaborate on the role of the alliance and then discuss the role of the collaborative. The alliance of research-based organizations that directly serve states, districts, and schools will be able to provide these critical services. First, help build, validate, and support the use of a specialized knowledge base for education. Second, utilize and advocate for the Evidence Advocacy Center implementation guides that help states and districts effectively apply research-based policies and practices. Third, help build and provide services to the consortium of a small number of states and districts committed to transforming education into a trustworthy, largely self-regulating, research-based profession. This transformation will allow states to defer to the education profession's knowledge base in legislation and regulations concerning critical aspects of education. Finally, the Alliance will serve as a resource to the collaborative. So I'll say a bit more about the collaborative. It brings together these groups most harmed by the underperformance of the education system: business organizations, elected officials, social justice organizations, family and parent groups, community colleges, and technical schools. The collaborative's advisors will include representatives from the Alliance, researchers, high-performing states, districts, and schools that have sustained high achievement greater than would be anticipated based on the demographics of their students. The collaborative would support the Alliance in its role of delivering services to states, districts, and schools and educator preparation programs, advocate for the creation of a research-based education profession by engaging in tasks such as media advocacy campaigns and discussions with key education and political leaders. Finally, identify or help create the entity that would house and administer the creation and maintenance of a research-based education profession. Possible examples might be the National Governors Association or the Education Commission of the states. So 3 takeaways. We've got to transform education to prevent the continuing failure of the school system with so many students. I'm currently involved in implementing a model to reform the judicial criminal justice system that is largely fed by individuals with a unsatisfactory education. The transformation requires the 5 pillars, and it's going to require working together of the alliance of insiders and the collaboration of outsiders to make this happen. So I'm going to close with a historical note here. During her term as Second Lady, Lynn Cheney was an ardent advocate for effective reading instruction. Having been honored as a founding father of the Texas Reading Initiative, President Bush appointed me to the National Institute for Literacy. In that role, I met with the vice president's wife on a top floor of the American Enterprise Institute to discuss how to promote effective reading practices. The meeting was memorable because it suddenly turned into a fire drill. The Secret Service had not scoped out the emergency exit, leading to quite a flurry of excitement as we rushed down the stairs. This memory prompts me to hope that AEI will contribute to the genuine firestorm needed to transform education into a research-based profession. In particular, the American Enterprise Institute is uniquely qualified to contribute to the formation of the collaborative. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Doug. No pressure. I'll do my best to live up to that. I'm going to introduce Sarah and Mike in a moment, but before we open the conversation, let me play devil's advocate for just a second, Doug, with the presentation. I mean, obviously, I find this to be a compelling line of thought. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. When we talk about education's pendulum swings, I feel like every bad PD, professional development I went to as a teacher, at one point had the presenter saying, well, we know from research, or this is research based. In other words, we hear these claims all the time. So I can hear a teacher saying, well, look, everything I do is research based, or I was told it was research based. That's one problem. The other is what we mean by measurement. So, for example, one of the things that turned me into a curriculum advocate, since you invoked Emily Hanford and sold a story, well, I mean, back in the day, I taught at a low-performing public school in the South Bronx that was a Lucy Calkins demonstration school. And it's taken 25 years to uproot that from New York City. I could hear devotees of that curriculum, and they remain, saying things like, well, look, the research may support phonics, but show me the research that tells me how to instill a love of reading in my students, make them fall in love with books, because that was one of the things the teachers loved about that program. So how do we define what is and is not research based? And how do we stop these broad claims? In other words, that what I described in the PD, everything is research based, or at least we're told as teachers, everything is research based.
Well, one of the things the Evidence Advocacy Center has in its plan down the road is to convene a professions adversary advisory committee. Sorry. These members have expertise in adjudicating evidence, such as that the Evidence Advocacy Center is compiling. And they also will be valuable in outlining what constitutes the infrastructure of a genuine profession. So these are the organizations that we would consider including. The Uniform Certified Public Accountant Examination is designed to assess the knowledge and skills, entry skills for a CPA. The United States Medical Licensing Examination, and the National Maritime Center that administers the Merchant Marine Credential. So the idea is if you want to validate the legitimacy of what constitutes evidence, we feel that one approach is to bring together the professions that do work from research and evidence and let them engage in a review so that we can come up with some third party, more neutral yet very powerful adjudication about what constitutes research.
Okay, let's bring Mike Schmoker and Sarah Oberly into the conversation. Mike, you first. You have long argued that schools already know what works but fail to do it. So let's talk about implementation and why it's so elusive. Is it a failure of professional will? Is it system design? Is it something else?
Well, I'm sure to some degree it's professional will because I think the whole profession's sort of been allowed to lapse into a certain complacency. We think we're about as good as we'll ever be, and so we don't really struggle to or have real hope or aspirations that we could be a lot better than we are. I always think of the late Richard Elmore, who's this, titanic professor at Harvard, and he talked about this thing called the buffer. And schools inadvertently and sometimes deliberately have created this picture of themselves, somewhat understandably, that the schools are operating on the best science, the best research. Your kids are getting the best that the profession has to offer. And it looks that way to almost all of the public, I suspect. And so we have inflated grades, inflated graduation rates. All of these things kind of sap the urgency needed to urge us to look beyond current levels of performance and reach for higher levels. Of course, the entire system, from teacher prep to PD, is allowed to exist in this kind of free-for-all culture when the buffer hides both the impact of and the research behind most of what goes on in the school. So for my money, we need to create systems which would include a lot of the things that Doug just described, and just even really basic things. Doug just talked about research. If we even were allowed, if teachers were allowed to say, okay, hang on a minute, I'm being asked to use the Lucy Calkins model. You say it's research based. Could you just be a little more specific than that? I think if years ago people would have said, really lay out the research for the Calkins model and compare it with other evidence that is contrary to it, I think a lot of this stuff would have been exposed. We need an entire culture that asks, what do you mean by it's research based? Tell us more, give us evidence. And if forgive me for being long-winded, but take something like explicit instruction, which I think most of us are keen on. If enough teachers, educators, administrators had just been given the opportunity to examine the evidence for explicit instruction as opposed to its alternatives, I think we'd be living in a different world today.
Look, that resonates with me. And again, I don't want to universalize my own journey as a classroom teacher, but I was an alternative certification teacher. So I
Mm,
began teaching fifth grade in the South Bronx shortly before my 40th birthday. In other words, it had been nearly 30 years before I'd set foot in an elementary school at all. And last time I'd been as a student. But I do remember very clearly thinking, this does not resemble, talking about Lucy Calkins, anything like what I remember about learning to read. And honestly, I don't remember that much explicit instruction at all in
mm,
reading. So I've described my own kind of trajectory into my interest in research-based practice as willing suspension of disbelief, followed by incredulity, followed by militance, as I realized that what I was being told was best practice was
right.
really not. With that, let me bring in Sarah Oberly. And as I said before, we've been talking about teachers, not to them, and that's why Dr. Oberly is with us today. Sarah, from where you sit, does teaching feel like a profession, the way Doug defined it? What parts of your daily work feel professional? What parts don't?
Thanks, Rob. You know, I think Doug mentioned the science of reading movement, which I think has made way for teachers to develop expertise that does make us feel like we have professionalized our decision making. Um, Unfortunately, I don't see that happening in the other content areas. My hope is that with the success of this movement, we can start to push in the other areas of classroom instruction, behavior management, all of those things. But what I have usually see is colleagues who have noticed that what they're doing isn't effective, that they don't have the knowledge to understand why or understand what is going wrong with their students. So they're seeking this out themselves.
Mm,
And to me and my colleagues, it feels like we should understand this. We should be given the knowledge to understand how our students are learning and when something is going wrong, what we can do. So, the programs that we have now for science of reading, I think, do feel very aligned and consistent. And it does feel like we're making progress in terms of we're getting PD that is sharing with us how students pick up literacy skills. We're starting to understand, notice, intervene, modify what we're doing based on the knowledge that we have to say, okay, I understand that this is going wrong and I know what to do, or I know who to ask. I taught Lucy when I was a new teacher, and I came from a different sector. I was in marketing previously. So coming into the classroom and teaching Lucy, and I thought, like, what are we doing? How are they learning this? I mean, it just didn't feel right to me. But here I am, in my mid 20s coming in thinking, well, they obviously know what they're doing. So in terms of, how Mike mentioned, ask questions, ask for evidence. We are not encouraged to do that. And as I,
mhm.
have gone through my career, learned more, gone back to school, asking questions does not make you very favorable
Popular.
in terms of, your supervisors. So, we are in a hard situation because we become knowledgeable. We know what we're looking for. We know how to intervene. And sometimes we're told you can't do that because you have to, show fidelity of the program, or because this is what we have and we have a contract for 3 more years. So this is what we're going to be using. So yes, I think that there needs to be a checks and balances system. I think that somebody needs to be responsible for saying, not just this is research based, but what does that actually mean? And what do you mean by research? I think that's another conversation, and Doug alluded to that already. But as a profession, I almost feel like we are not supposed to be seen as professionals. And
Mhm.
I know I teach primary, so that's a little bit of a different culture. But when I'm at a PD and I'm asked to get up and do some kind of dance or something, that doesn't feel professional.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, you've written about this in the past. Yeah, I remember more than once in my own career teaching elementary school, saying to people, "Look, I signed up to teach elementary school, not to take it." There is something very infantilizing about some of those PDs that we do. Sarah, do you mind, at the risk of asking too personal a question? I think of you as being very research based. We met, I think, several years ago at a research ed conference. That's how I know you. What was your own trajectory from what I was describing as that willing suspension of disbelief? I don't think I knew that you were also a Lucy Calkins teacher back in the day. What led you, or how did you start down this path towards, no, no, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing?
I think in my own practice, it takes you years to be experienced enough to feel confident that, maybe what they're doing isn't right. So to feel the confidence to question what you're being told to do. And at that point, I noticed that some of my students weren't picking things up and I didn't know why, and I didn't know what to do. Not just in reading, overall. And I personally felt like, well, if I am not given this knowledge to support my students in this way, then I want to know what's going on behind the scenes. I want to understand what's going wrong. So I, personally took it upon myself, and I'm not saying that other teachers should have to do that. I don't think they should have to do that. But I was very much compelled to understand my students and their issues so that I could support them accordingly.
Yeah, there is I don't have data on this, but it's remarkable to me that just about every teacher I know who thinks of himself or herself as research driven tells a story about being an autodidact, about discovering things on their own. That seems like a common through line.
Mm.
Let me play devil's advocate again, for all of us, in the conversation. I can imagine a teacher listening to this conversation when we say things like evidence-based practice and professional accountability and hearing the word not empowerment, but compliance. True or false?
Robert, could you rephrase that?
In other words, we are painting a picture here, are we not, of a world in which teachers are research driven, true professionals, respected and treated as professionals.
Hmm.
But I don't think I don't think I'm being incorrect to say there's a certain cynicism that's built in among teachers who've heard things like this before. So we're saying evidence-based, we're saying professional. They're not hearing a message of empowerment. They're hearing a message as, oh, here are these people demanding compliance. You're going to tell me how to teach.
Well, I think that's the state we're in right now, when we always step up and say, here's the new thing we're going to do. Trust us, it's research based. And that's the way it is at the moment. To change that, I think we need more teachers encouraged, and I don't know where this might begin, to create a culture where more teachers are encouraged to say, all right, you're saying we have to comply with this new quote unquote research-based practice. Please, as professionals, you're professionals, we're professionals. Can you please just give us a little more detail on this than just telling us it's research-based?
I would push back on that a little bit because I think not that teachers shouldn't be asking questions, but by the time an initiative has come down to us,
Hmm.
millions and millions of dollars have been spent on bringing someone in to give professional development, on purchasing a new curriculum. And somewhere along the line, someone believes it's research based, whether it's the publisher that has the big HQIM stamp on the cover, and from what criteria did they get that? Or it's the district administrators who have the budget, who are making the decisions. Because by the time it's getting down to us, it's really typically it's there's nothing that can be done.
Hmm.
It's we'll
Hmm.
circle back to this, give it a chance, trust the process. And frankly, teachers don't have, and I know you're saying that they should. Teachers don't have the research capacity. They're not accessing. They're not reading. Um, and they could. I think they're very capable. I don't know if I would put that on us necessarily. But I think somewhere along the line, before these initiatives or these programs, curriculum are purchased, that needs to be the conversation going on.
I think one of the reasons that having a profession, a genuine profession, is that it can act early in the process to prevent
Hmm.
what you're experiencing and what teachers have experienced for for a long, long time. In other words, this imposition comes at a time where they are helpless and often hopeless. if you have an education profession, and I think it goes back to the shared knowledge base, that then in turn can inform the criteria for the selection of instructional materials. And that's starting early in the chain so that the publishers who all will claim they're research based. Once I used to give a lot of speeches when I was doing this many, many years ago. And I would define research as anything you've ever seen or heard. And so I think the need to have a legitimate knowledge base, that's why I went on about how to adjudicate research. We have to have the research that is valid, because for a collaborative to form to back this change, they have to have confidence that we know what the research is and that it's been validated by external entities who have a history of working from evidence. But I think one of the encouraging things is, in terms of this bottom-up movement of teachers, is the Facebook. What teachers found about the science of what I should have learned in college. They have 243,000 members. Now, this is an example of this spontaneous bottoms up that needs to be understood, supported, nurtured, because changing the education system from the top down only will not work. It will not work because the teachers can close the door and do as they please. So we have to simultaneously nurture these grassroots movements like the research ed conferences do, and lots of professional development now that's more evidence oriented, so that teachers, as you said, Sarah, begin to feel more confident that yes, there is evidence and we can and should speak up about it. So we need to look at not top down or bottom up. We need to look at top down and bottom up. And that synergy between the two is the only way that we're going to make these changes. And in making those changes, it's very important that we honor and respect and acknowledge the difficulty educators are going to have in making these changes. In other words, we have to be firm, but we have to be sympathetic and supportive, because it's true. If someone comes in and asks you to change how you view the world and puts some pressure on you, that's very unpleasant and it's difficult. So we need the carrot and the stick from the top and from the bottom.
Yeah, Doug, I'm enrolled in a few of those Facebook groups that you described, about the science of reading and everything I didn't learn in ed school and whatnot. And they've always felt to me like an indictment, frankly, of our schools of education, of the systems that train and acculturate teachers. In other words, and maybe this is, of course, an illustration of your point. I'm not gainsaying it, but what does it say about the profession when the only reliable route that we have to become an evidence-based practitioner is doing it on your own? That the channels by which we accredit and acculturate teachers simply don't do it.
Oh. Well, that's why I'm here today. If we don't change the licensure procedure, the teacher preparation programs, the 5 pillars, then we're not going anywhere. And let me be very clear. I wish there were a simpler way to fix this problem, because creating a genuine profession is going to be incredibly difficult. So I'd love an alternative, simpler solution, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Sarah and Mike's thoughts on this, but it feels to me, and I don't say this to sound cynical or defeatist, but it feels to me like a bit of a Gordian knot, right? In other words, on the one hand, we're saying we need to trust teachers, create, a self-governing profession, but you want to do that among 3.7 million teachers who, by and large, have not been given what they need to do that successfully. So that's what I mean when I say it's a Gordian knot. So Sarah or Mike, help me out here. How are we gonna, if this is the journey of 1,000 miles, what's step one?
Well, I guess I'll just say, I go back to what Doug writes about it, entrenched ideologies that reign supreme in our ed colleges. To change those is going to take a lot of, again, your expression, external pressure. It's going to be so tough. Everything begins, I think, at ed colleges. If they changed significantly, an awful lot of wonderful things would ensue. But they're also the toughest bunch to change. You've got people like Arthur Levine. How many years ago did Arthur Levine write that castigation of our ed colleges? And yet, no movement. Periodically, people, go after the ed colleges, and not much happens. You have to hope that something like EAC or these alliances or consortiums maybe start small in certain states, and they begin to demonstrate that if our practice conforms to the best research we know, the highest leverage stuff we have access to, that it really makes a profound difference. And maybe I'm idealistic, but I tend to think that if we did more to make both the damage done by a mediocre public school system and the immense, and I want to say nearly immediate benefits, almost immediate benefits that come from good practice, and we could make those vivid and bring those in every way we can to the attention of the public, communities, work with school boards, that enough positive attention would come to those, and that would give us some leverage to maybe even approach or begin to kind of infiltrate the culture of ed colleges, where they'd be forced, like medicine was, to realize, gosh, we've got to, for instance, we've got to start to teach our teachers to teach phonics, or we're hurting kids. I think we need to make stories of real schools and their gains a big part of that effort.
Sarah, I'm curious to what degree you are an evangelist in your own school and among other educators, frontline educators that you work with. How receptive folks are to say, "Huh, I want to be like Sarah."
Um, well, I'm pretty modest in my own setting because I don't want to set off, dynamics with my colleagues that are unfavorable. That's another conversation. I will say that the K1, 2, even 3 teachers that are now privy to literacy foundations, I do see that they feel empowered. And so my hope is that teachers in general become more receptive to learning more of the how learning happens for all content areas, be content agnostic about memory and attention. Regarding what Mike said, I mean, we have student teachers coming and they're having to write whole lesson plans and include how they are catering to students' learning styles. So we have, a lot of correction to be done on the teacher's side. You are guilty until proven innocent when you come at us with it's research based. Well, we've heard it all before.
Yep.
And I think, there could be some programs that maybe they would be, successful for our students, but then we don't have fidelity of implementation. The teachers aren't given the information that they need to implement the program correctly. And then, we're not seeing the results in our students. We feel betrayed again by another initiative that went south. So, teachers for sure have a lot of mistrust. But what I see student teachers coming from the universities and the things that they're doing, I'm like, that is so loosely coupled, if at all, with practice, with real life practice.
Way to say loosely coupled. Mike, you said something that I wanted to push back on a little bit, or you acknowledged something, I guess is a better way to say it. When you talked about um, ideology within schools of education. It is one thing to be evidence-based. It is another thing to shake people from ideology. Ideology, almost by definition, is something that you are not just closely attached to, but take some of your identity from, right? So, I
Sure.
mean, do you have a magic formula for kind of de-ideologizing, if that's a word, our schools of
Well,
education?
I wish I did. And again, this might be idealistic. But I tend to think, let's take Sarah's example of learning styles, which still, are so commonly accepted in schools.
Yeah.
What if there was, whichever direction it came from, what if there were opportunities to say, hey, there's a lot of us in our school have adopted and learned in our ed colleges that learning styles are important. Let's look at the evidence for that. And I do think that you'd at least get some, if not a large number of people to shake that off if they read Brian Goodwin, who writes the research page for Education Leadership, multiple other people, and then just asked teachers if they've ever seen real evidence in a lesson, a unit where learning styles really made the difference. We used to call it action research, that old term. I wish our schools were more oriented toward examining something we now embrace, like learning styles, or you name it, and said, well, great, let's give it a trial run. Sarah, you love learning styles. Show us in a single lesson or a unit where learning styles really made the difference. I think that would make a difference. Not with everybody all at once, but eventually.
But surely, we've all been in enough classrooms and schools to have met that teacher who says, and boy, I feel badly about this as soon as I say this because I feel like I'm being oppositional. I'm broadly supportive of what we're talking about here, but I feel the need to kind of
Sure.
play interlocutor. We've all seen that teacher who says, well, I know it works. I've been a teacher for 20 years. I know my classes. I know my students.
See, and again, I would love us to create, an environment in which I know and I don't know where this could begin. It could begin with a teacher like Sarah, or Sarah and some of her like-minded peers in a school or a district. Some of this happened in districts I worked in, at least in small ways, where I know was no longer sufficient. And enough people began to say, if you say I know, great. Okay, we respect that. But then you've got to show us. And I think in a couple of my last books, I've recommended if you see something works, literally show us in a single lesson how many kids out of your 28 students learned an important curriculum-based objective using something that you say you know is effective. The moment you do that, we'll listen. In fact, we'll give you time at a faculty meeting or a PD day to do a little 6, 8, 10-minute presentation on how this thing that you know is truly effective. I think that would purify and exclude an awful lot of junk.
I think in
And
an
it
ideal
also, just to
world,
finish that thought, it would also allow people who are doing the right thing, forgive my interruption, the right stuff to demonstrate, wow, we're no longer getting 10 or 12 kids out of 30 to learn. I got 25, 28 kids learning, like teachers I know, almost every lesson in a school with 95% pre-introduced lunch. We need positive and negative data. Forgive me, Sarah. Go ahead.
I agree with everything you're saying. I wish that teachers raising red flags was met with the response that you're describing.
Mm.
Um, some of us have state level accountability that includes criteria that we clearly know is not evidence supported. Yet we're getting observed, and why is this? Why aren't you, why aren't you asking the students to figure it out? And here we are, and
Mm.
it's all performative.
Mm.
But it is very frustrating when we are saying, hey, this is not appropriate. This is a problem because of the knowledge that we have. And then we are met with, well,
Yes, yes,
sorry, or
yes.
you'll see it scaffolds. They'll come back to it. So I want to be in that school that you're describing, Mike, where the teachers can raise concerns out of knowledge, and they are met with, well, let's look into that. You're right. In regards to what you mentioned, Rob, there's always going to be people that the dissonance is just so strong, and the more you tell them that what they're doing needs to change, the more they're going to dig in. I think that's just human nature. But again, if we were more of a profession, we could say, well, I'm sorry that you don't believe that. That's not what you're going to do, though, because this is what we are doing now. And that's not the culture.
Yeah. I mean, all roads, it feels to me, lead to culture, not just the culture of individual schools or even districts, but the culture of the profession itself.
Mhm.
Again, I don't want to sound cynical or dismissive, but that just feels like an extraordinarily heavy lift to say we just have to change teachers' mindsets about the work that they do.
But I think, Robert, that change in mindset is something that happened in the earlier professions. For example, in accounting before the Depression, they used subjective judgment about what value was. And sea captains could sail wherever they want before they created the safe sea lane. So there's always the need for a cultural shift. And you're right about the Gordian knot, but also remember, Alexander the Great cut it.
Well done.
And
Um,
now, was it Alexander Flexner? No, what was it? Abraham, forgive me.
yeah.
Abraham Flexner's, big report. Now and then something big comes along and just transforms, say, medical profession. And I tend to think at least part of that transformation was he was good at disseminating the negative effect of poor medical practice and the positive effects of proper medical practice. And I just think it could be like, 1,000 cases, stories, examples of where good practice paid off. And I got to say, quantitatively, we got to stop saying, oh, it was really good or it really worked. We've got to say, look, this many more kids learned in this kind of a setting. And I think enough of those stories could start to accumulate and have an
Yeah.
impact.
I'm glad you brought up the Flexner report from over a century ago. Uh, After Doug published that piece on my Substack, it rattled around quite a lot. It was very gratifying, but I did see one thread on LinkedIn that was frankly dismissive. So I want to talk about that and see what Doug has to say about
Hmm.
it. The thrust of it was like, look, medicine is not teaching. It's a hard science. Doctors have tight protocols. They have to learn a vast body of technical knowledge. Teaching is just different. It's human. It's the humanities. It's art. etc. In other words, just flat out rejecting the idea that something that is human, as it were, can be a hard science or can have the same level of technical specificity as medicine. Doug, what's your response to that?
Well, I think that what we need to acknowledge is that in all professions and education, once it becomes one, there is a tremendous role for judgment and experience.
Mm.
So let me give you an example. Let's say that you've got a teacher who is working from a research-based program. Let's say it's even scripted. We'll go to the extreme on explicit instruction.
Mm.
Now, here this person is needing to respond on a moment-to-moment basis, unceasing, to support kids who have misunderstandings, to deal with behavior problems, monitoring the engagement and learning of all these students. This is at the heart of teaching. A program is a set of words. It means little without the experience and judgment of a teacher who can then take that and make it useful to him or her in these moment to moment interactions that really constitute everything we care about.
I so agree. Yeah.
Uh,
Sarah, I'll bet you do too. Sorry, Robert, I don't mean to. But I'll bet Sarah probably agrees with Doug or
I mean, the amount of decisions and modifications that have to be made second to second are yeah. I mean, it's incredible. But yeah, I think that we're not losing the human side when we're implementing a scripted program. We're not, sucking the magic out of our students' learning experiences. And I think that that tends to be the quick response or the concern. So I appreciate what Doug is saying, that there are so many other things that go on besides just delivering content and engaging with content that makes teaching.
We have about 15 or 20 minutes left, so I want to encourage folks who are listening to us live to send their questions to Annika Hernandez. Her email address is on the flyer for the event. It's annika.hernandez@aei.org. I want to go back and further dive more deeply into the role of the kind of the governing organizations here. So professions, if we are to become one, depend on shared training, on certification, on peer accountability. Which of those is missing, and which of those is easiest or hardest to build? Doug, why don't you take that?
The hardest that's going to be institutionalized is accountability. And the reason for that is you have to give the educators the skill, the knowledge, and resources so that accountability is reasonable. So, for example, my nephew's teaching in a high poverty school, middle school history with a class of 35 to 40 low income, many highly disruptive students. So, until we deal with I focus obviously on the research base, but we also have a resource problem. And when we talk about the research base, we're not just talking about teachers. If the administrators don't have it, then they'll be doing the things that we see all the time. They don't know what's going on. Teacher's doing great work, and the administrator says, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." So anyway, we really have to recognize that the enormity of the task is worth the effort, and that accountability can come about once we do all the other things that are necessary and reasonable. And again, these will happen concurrently. Right now, districts and states have provisions for accountability. Tomorrow, they could, in fact, require the use of evidence-based practices in their schools. They could do it tomorrow. Now, then you've got the teacher organizations, the unions, the culture of the school not wanting to confront it. There's a long list of reasons why this isn't happening. But the governance content is already there if we have the energy and the will and the effort to form a collaborative and alliance to support this large effort. We need someone like Alexander the Great to cut the Gordian knot, and it may not be a person, it may be the professionalization of the education system that will cut the Gordian knot.
So this feels to me, if I squint, like you're describing the education reform movement of 25 years ago. At least that's how we thought of ourselves, right? Look, AEI is a policy shop, so let's talk about the role of policymakers a little bit more in this. My own sense is that the education reform movement kind of hit the rocks when it morphed in from a kind of a youthful can-do movement into something that was more, frankly, top-down, technocratic, unlovely. In other words, it just got reduced to testing, 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 and everything we need to know about schools we know by looking at test results. Are there lessons to learn? So this is a two-part question, really, for any of the panelists. Are there lessons to be learned from that? From the education reform movement, that will keep us from repeating that mistakes. And if so, what is the advice to policymakers to help bring about this vision that we're trying to talk into existence?
Well, let me give one example. If you look at the Common Core and the exams that were related to them, they weren't done what I would consider in a professional manner. And what do I mean by that? The Common Core experts, for example, in math and reading, none of them came from high-performing schools or districts.
Hmm.
In other words, we have great value on schools and districts and states that have shown how to do it. And what we did in the old reform movement, we played the old game of let's get a representative from NEA, from the national, the international reading. So you bring in all of the the people who are so far removed from kids and teachers, and they sit
Mm,
around and make up this stuff that is not grounded in real world experience. I have a colleague who was an incredible statistician who was hired by one of the two testing companies. And she went to the boss and said, these items, they're ridiculously hard, some of them. And the boss said, oh, set the bar high enough and they'll strive to reach it. She quit. There's so much idiocy that
yeah.
was part of the quote reform because it wasn't informed by people who knew how to make it work. That's why in the Evidence Advocacy Center, we place such a high value on practitioners who've
Mm,
actually made it happen in the field. Randomized control trials may or may not be relevant, but as control trials, they're not relevant. The question is, can they be translated? And you don't know. That's why we've spent a lot of time seeking out high-performing districts, high-performing schools.
right.
Like Mike said, there are lots of stories. There's a lot of research there. We've put that together. But we also have to have the negative side. This is I used to do a lot of policy work in Texas, and Darv Winnick was my mentor there. And he did an op-ed for the Houston Chronicle. So he was interviewing this recent graduate from the teacher prep program. And she went on and on about how wonderful the program was. And it was just exactly what she wanted. And then she ended up by saying, the only problem is they brought me the wrong kids.
Just to echo that, I'm thinking of a certain school in the Phoenix area where they looked at the state standards, which say in math. This is a school they were going to close, mind you. And the assistant principal comes in and says, they're going to close our school and send the kids out to the other schools in the district unless we raise our achievement, especially in math. And so she said, how about if we create a curriculum? The teachers themselves created the curriculum in about 2 hours, roughly, and then kind of refined it at subsequent meetings during the first semester. All they did was look at the state standards, grab the ones that were the clearest to them, laid them out on a 36-week schedule, and began to teach them. Two things very interesting there. And you talk about working backwards from real schools and real results. This is what we ought to be doing. Every teacher there, someone checked in to make sure they were actually following that schedule that for in algebra, geometry, and the other courses. So they really were getting taught. At the end of 2 years, they had made the largest gains. They were one of 3 schools that had made the largest gains in the state of Arizona. One more interesting feature of it was the teacher who scored the highest in that really exceptional 2-year period was the teacher who taught very carefully explicit instruction.
Hmm.
That's all they did. They incorporated a teacher-built curriculum. Most of the teachers tried to teach with some explicit instruction, but the one that really went all in on explicit instruction got the best results. At this school, by the way, with about 95% free or reduced lunch. I think we need to work backward from cases like that as often as we can, instead of putting committees together that consist of people who don't know anything about classrooms or actual achievable results.
Okay, so that's a compelling story, Mike, but tell me what the transferable lessons are from that, especially if I'm a policymaker.
Well, if it was me, if policy applies across the country, maybe, and again, I'm spitballing here, okay? If we could collect and describe more of these kinds of stories. I've asked educational leadership, for instance, who's my, ASCD is my publisher, to do more, to invite people, not just to say, here's what we did and boy, did it work well, but to give us evidence of what really happened and give us some kind of a description of what they did and how in numerical terms they got better results. I think if we fill the air with results like those, if enough of us did it, have to be way more of us than do that now, I think it could start to move the needle.
Okay. Sarah, I want to give you the opportunity to speak to policymakers. And should professionalism be led by policymakers, by teachers themselves? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I would love to see the magical policymaker that spent a long time in the classroom and also was in administration. So, has the breadth of experience. But what I'll say about policy, when you talk about reform, I think one of the problems that we have with the pendulum is that we dive in head first. We do an about face with prematurely without fully understanding. Okay, hold on. What's the best way to do this? How do we roll this out to teachers with the appropriate training? Because then, we change everything. And if we don't get the results that we're looking for, well, that didn't work. Now we're going to do something completely different. So I think there are some premature, swift changes that, and I see it happening right now with science of learning. People that are leaning on retrieval practice and some of the very solid practices that come from cognitive science. But when you start getting in before you really have a respect for what's behind it, understanding it, it mutates quickly, and then we have a very diluted situation. And then, we then, as we do in education, we say, well, that didn't work. Now let's do the total opposite thing. So, I think we just need to hold on, and I don't know how to get that message across. But I think we are, unfortunately, as Emily Hanford doesn't want us, I think we are going to continue to make these whiplash inducing changes until we say, we need to really understand this and do this carefully before we throw the book at them. Like, during COVID, the amount of technology that was thrown at us, it was about quantity. It wasn't about quality. And so just being mindful of, why are we doing this, and what is this for, and what's the best way to do it, I think is needs to happen a little bit more.
Well, I think that's wise. I would, my own 2 cents is I would also preach patience to policymakers. I've said before, I'm an unabashed and unapologetic disciple of E.D. Hirsch Jr. And if there's one thing I learned from him, it's that language growth, if we're talking about literacy, is a slow growing plant. Or as I kind of have joked over the years, you show me a miracle and I'll show you a scandal. It doesn't work that way. So my message to policymakers would be there are no quick fixes, and you have to be patient with this. Look, I want to pick up a thread that we started to talk about and then kind of dropped. So I want to get you to focus on it for a moment, which is state certification and licensure. Teaching is heavily regulated, obviously, but those mechanisms do not guarantee competence, I guess is a mild way to put it. Do you see room to rework those systems to function as a kind of professional gatekeeping mechanism that protects quality, that is accountable to Doug's point, and really drives results?
Yeah, I think it's very doable. And I think again, what we've got a marriage is the research and the judgment and experience of people who are from high performing systems. So that by bringing those people to bear, you're bringing in the realistic, the pragmatic. And so by joining these voices, you've got the guardrails of the research, but you've got their experience of how their research aligned work actually plays out. You can come up with a very powerful system that isn't dehumanizing. And I want to go back quickly to Mike's point about you asked what policy you would extract from that, Robert. Well, what policy I would extract is if you can get teachers in 2 hours to work from what's clear in the standards and do nothing else and get those kind of results, you need to clean up your instructional programs and your standards. This is just one more example of if you do things intelligently, you bring people in who have done the work and you work with the people who know the research, and you've got to have the collaborative for the outside pressure. You can start putting these pieces together. But this is a complex system and all the parts have to work. And I think I've
Mm.
shared this with you before, Robert. I was flying into National to do a speech, and in the speech I just written, getting ready to give it, that education is like an airplane. It's a very complex system, and if any part fails, the whole thing won't work. And so just as I wrote that, the pilot came on, there was a siren in the cockpit. The pilot said, we have a condition here. We're being diverted to Baltimore because our flaps may not work. So that's why when we can't take one little piece and say, fix it, because it's too complex a system. And it does make for the Gordian knot. We just have to decide whether we care enough about the students and their families and the future if we're going to deal with it. That's the decision.
Boy, this has flown by, and I see we're almost at time. So I want to conclude by giving each of you a chance to reflect and answer an exit question, if you like, which is: imagine it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, education has become a true profession that we've taken Doug's work as a word, and we've implemented it. What would look and feel different for teachers, for students, and for America, for the public? Doug, I'm going to give you the last word. Let's start with Mike, then Sarah, then Doug.
What would look different, Robert?
Yeah, how will we know when we get there?
Yeah. Well, for me, I'm a priority is a very big thing for me. And so I would hope during those 5 years, one of the first things we did was not only look at evidence of what works, but, and this is important as anything, we decide, where do we begin? What are the biggest levers? And for me, I think you can make a pretty decent case that it's really about three things: that every teacher operates on a teacher-friendly curriculum. They know what to teach and when, to use that beautiful expression Linda Darling Hammond uses. If every teacher had one of those, that by itself, I think there's reasons to believe that is the biggest lever in all of education. That, secondly, it has to abound in and be literacy rich. It has to be abundant opportunities during the school day for students to be reading and discussing and writing about what they read. And third, all of this, or most of it, let's say, would be taught with explicit instruction, and every teacher taught in that. If just those three things were operative within 5 years, it put people like me out of business, because our schools would be thriving on all three of those major fronts. And if I could just throw in one little postscript, since we've talked so much about policy, just to get this one shot in, I wonder if Emily Hanford's success on phonics shouldn't be the model for everything else we want to do, even through, maybe especially through, whatever she did caused this massive change in phonics. I wonder if EAC and the consortiums and collaboratives that Doug is beginning to establish might learn from that in order to bring about a system in which the good things begin to happen.
I actually have a take on why Emily Hanford succeeded so brilliantly when those of us who think of ourselves as education reformers failed. And it's
Mm,
simply because she didn't blame teachers. If you think about
mm,
the logic or the dynamic of education reform, it was, look, you know what to do. We're going to hold you accountable for doing it. Then along comes Emily Hanford, who demonstrates quite convincingly that teachers do not know what to do, not because they are indifferent or poor practitioners. They were literally, what was her phrase, sold a story. They were told what is best practice is not. So
mm,
how do you hold teachers accountable for being trained badly and being led astray by putative experts. I think that's, at least for my money, that's the lesson of Emily Hanford's work that we can all take away. Sarah, you are in a better position than the rest of us to say what your work and your life will look like differently 10 years from now, 5 years from now, if we become more of a profession.
I think I'd like to focus on the way that we educate teachers.
Mhm.
Obviously I want to see our students all literate and have the foundations that they need early on to move on and be successful. But I think that's going to start with the way that we teach pre-service teachers and the kind of professional development that they give. And when we talk about credentialing teachers, if the expectations are not evidence-based, then and that's what we're credentialing teachers off of, then what kind of teachers are we sending into the classroom? So I think we need to look at how we're educating, what criteria we're using for credentialing, and then the continued education that teachers receive. Let it be valuable, let it be useful. Like I said, I teach first grade. I don't need another training on teen dating violence. I think if we focus on empowering teachers with the knowledge, not just do this lesson, do this lesson, do this lesson, but to help them understand also what's behind that. And teachers want that. We want to feel like professionals. We want to feel like we understand what's happening and why.
Professor Doug Carnine, we are here because of you. You set this webinar in motion, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to close it out. What
Well,
will success look like 5 years from now?
actually, I went to put together what Mike and Sarah said. Mike talked about what the content might be. And Sarah talked about we've got to do it in pre-service and we've got to do it in continuing education because pre-service accounts for about 160,000 teachers a year and in-place workforce is 3.5 million. So if we're going to change the lives of kids, we've got to change the lives of teachers going into the profession and teachers who are currently working. They've got to get content that's valuable, legitimate. And if we did that, we would be changing, especially the 3.5 million who are currently working. We give them the tools and the motivation and the support they need, then we will be on the road to resolving this seemingly endless education crisis.
Great. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank Doug Carnine, Mike Schmoker, and Sarah Oberly for joining us today. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.